For the book. Our speaker is Dr. John Cole, Executive Director for the Center. Dr. Cole has a master's degree in liberal arts from the Johns Hopkins University and a PhD in American civilization from George Washington University. He joined the Library of Congress in 1966 as a librarian for CRS. From 1968 to 1975, he held several positions in what was then called the Reference Department. In 1976, he was named chairman of the library's Task Force on Goals, Organization, and Planning. In recognition of his leadership in directing the task force, he received the William A. Jump Meritorious Award for Exemplary Achievement in Public Administration. The following year, he joined the Office of Planning and Development, and in 1978, he was appointed director for the Center for the Book. Mr. Cole recently returned from a one-year leave of absence, during which time he worked as special consultant for the Department of Special Collections at Stanford University Libraries, and he also taught a few courses. Mr. Cole has written many articles and books about the Library of Congress, its history and activities. Some of the more important books include The Library of Congress in Perspective, and For Congress and the Nation, A Chronological History of the Library of Congress. Please welcome Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Stephen. I haven't heard some of that background for quite a while, but I'm glad to be reminded from whence I came. Also pleased to be here. I might say, however, at the very beginning that we certainly are not going to have a 2-hour session on the Center for the Book in the Library of Congress. What I would like to do would be to give you a presentation about what the Center for the Book does, and I will try to do it in the context of the course, touching on our special relations to publishing and perhaps passing on some of the wisdom or facts or opinions that I've gained in the last couple of years in working with the publishing community with the Center for the Book, then open it to questions, and perhaps some of these issues are worth further discussion, or perhaps you'd like to talk more about some of the Center for the Book's programs that I'll be mentioning. But I think that perhaps a 1 hour total might be appropriate for this presentation and for our discussion. Therefore, let me explain to you briefly what the Center for the Book is, why it was established, how it relates to the Library of Congress, and then describe some of our activities. The Center was established by Daniel Borston, our Librarian of Congress, in 1977. A special law was passed to create the Center. I was in the planning office at the time, as was related earlier. And the Librarian of Congress, for many years, it turns out, which unbeknownst to me, had been talking about the importance of books and the importance of the book in our society, and especially the importance of books in the electronic age. And before he became Librarian of Congress, as you may know, he was at the Smithsonian Institution as the head of the Museum of History and Technology. Also had done quite a bit of writing about American culture, and had published an article in Harper's Magazine, in fact, which was about books, but it was called something to the effect of a do-it-yourself mechanical device, one of these articles you often see now that didn't exactly say what it was he was talking about, but it said that this particular mechanical device was had many advantages in that it didn't have to be hooked in, didn't have to be plugged into anything, that it was portable, that it looked like a wonderful new invention that perhaps might change education, learning in our modern society. And then, of course, the punchline at the very end is that this brand new device also happens to be one that has been with us for a number of centuries, and it is called the BOOK. Carrying this with him, he created, when he came to the Library of Congress, wanted to create a office that would promote books and reading using the collections of the Library of Congress whenever possible, his opinion that the Library of Congress needed this kind of office was really buttressed by something that happened during our task force year. And as Stephen said, I was in charge of the librarians task force on goals, organization, and planning. This was one of these remarkable opportunities that only comes along when every once in a while. For example, when a new administrator comes in. And we spent 1 year, and I think some of the people in this room worked with us on this task force, looking at the Library of Congress and its goals and putting out a report, which we published, which said what we thought the Library of Congress should be doing in the future. Many employees were involved in that, but also a number of outsiders were. And this is where the publishers come in. The librarian decided that he wanted a group of outsiders representing what he saw as each of the library's major constituencies. So we had 10 outside groups, in addition to 15 internal committees. But the outside groups included scholars, but they were divided by fields: social scientists, humanities advisory group. There was a libraries advisory group. There was a separate law advisory group. But there was one for publishers, and it was called the Publishers Advisory Group. It was headed by Dan Lacey, whom many of you may know of. And it had on it a number of notable publishers, some of whom may be in your program schedule, I'm not certain. But Mr. Lacey was the chair, and there were 10 people from the publishing community. Interestingly enough, one of them was Carol Niemeyer, who today, of course, is our our associate librarian for national programs. That was the first time I met Mrs. Niemeyer. At any rate, the Publishing Advisory Group looked at what the Library of Congress was doing, even reviewed its own publishing program, and made recommendations about the library's own publications, the library's own journal, but then looked at the role of the Library of Congress with the publishing community and decided that, in fact, the Library of Congress didn't have much of a relationship to the world of publishing except for specific areas such as copyright. When a copyright controversy came up, of course, there was a close involvement. Now, you have to realize this was 1975. Things have changed since then in a lot of areas. But it also suggested that a special office be created, which later became the Center for the Book, which would relate to the Library of Congress's role with not only publishers, but the book community at large, quite apart from the library community and the technical processing part of the library community with which we have been connected since the turn of the century. So the general notion was that the Library of Congress might do more to relate to the world of the book, including publishing, education, and that something like the Center for the Book would be the logical agency to do it. So the forces came together. First of all, Dr. Borston came to the library with this in mind. After talking with him, the publishers agreed that this was a good idea. It was recommended. Special legislation was created and passed in 1977, creating the Center for the Book in the Library of Congress. A lot of people said, "What is this? What does it mean?" And I was one of those, because I was not in the job when the center was created. And there are some interesting things that happened when it was created. For a while, its title was almost the Center for Books in the Library of Congress, because there was a couple of senators said that it wouldn't be a good thing to call it the Center for the Book, because in our world there is only one book, and we don't need another Bible study center. All right? Well, that got changed. And in fact, the librarian said, what we are talking about is the book kind of generically and as a symbol, but in fact, what our center does is to promote books in general, reading, and the printed word. So we are not as hooked up to the book physically as one might think through our title, the Center for the Book. It's not a book, it's books. It's really the world of print that concerns us. We do our best to promote books and the world of print, and we do it through a variety of methods. First of all, we are a very small office, and I should mention two other things in the legislation that are really kind of interesting and important. The Center for the Book was given the power, the authority to raise money to keep itself going. And in fact, that's what's happened. is that the center all of its programs and projects are privately funded. My salary is paid for by the Library of Congress, but I have one assistant, Linda Cox, who used to be in the Copyright Office. Linda's salary is paid for by private contributions. All of our programs, projects, publications that I'll be showing you are paid for with private funds. What that means is that we have to raise $100,000 a year in order to keep our Center for the Book going. So fundraising is a major part of our effort, and thus far a good part of our money has come from the publishing community, even though we are trying now to raise money from anybody and everybody. But from the beginning, McGraw-Hill gave us a grant, and Time Inc. gave us a grant, and we also have money from various private donors, and now we are trying to get money from most of the larger publishers and suggesting that since what we do is in their direct interest, that it would be very nice if they would give us something like $2,500 every year. There aren't many publishers who do that, but a number of publishers do give us smaller grants in the neighborhood of $500 to $1,000 a year, but I do spend probably 1/3 of my time raising money. Now, what does the Center for the Book do after all of this preface? Well, if you're a Library of Congress employee, you've read about the Center for the Book in the LCIB. We basically hold symposia, have projects, have lectures, and put out publications that relate to the book in our society. Our activities, we involve businessmen, we involve educators, we involve librarians, but what we try to do is to pick a subject that will bring these groups together so they can address current issues or perhaps historical issues that we feel are worth addressing and that we think in the long run will enhance the role of the book and the printed word in society. In other words, part of what we're doing is to use that terrible phrase, which I don't like, but I can't seem to get around it. It's consciousness raising, it's awareness, it's that kind of activity. And the last time I wrote something for the preface of one of our publications, I didn't use the word awareness. I think I said instead what we try to do is to point out the advantages of the book in the electronic age or something like this. It's much more prosaic and mundane, but somehow I like it better than the word awareness. Nonetheless, we are a very, as you can tell, an organization that in part is a public relations office of the Library of Congress because we represent the Library of Congress in the publishing, educational, and book communities. Who do we bring together and what do we do? We bring together representatives from our National Advisory Board. When we set this operation up, we deliberately created what's got to be the world's largest National Advisory Board. And we have about 150 people, if you can imagine, who work with us. About 30 or 40 of them, however, are representatives of organizations. And our general notion is to get a good idea and to pass it on to another organization, whether it be the International Reading Association, the American Library Association, the National PTA, the Bibliographical Society of America, whatever it might be. All of these organizations are represented on our board, and we try to sell them on a good idea and then get them to pick it up and for them to carry it through, which one has to do if you are an office of only 2 people. You simply cannot get involved in major operations. We work in 3 areas. One is just plain old reading promotion, and I'll talk a little bit about some reading promotion projects. The second area, which we are most active, for again, lack of a better phrase, and if somebody can give me better phrases today, I would love it. I call it the book in society, and it, generally speaking, is looking at the history of books, but also looking at the future of books and the future of the printed word in our electronic society. Now, this is where most of the publishers are terribly interested in the Center for the Book's activity, and this is where a lot of our activities have fallen. Then our third area, which is interesting and was one I didn't really bargain for, is one I call the international role of the book. And we are very involved with UNESCO and the UNESCO book development and book promotion projects, and we were one of the involved in the planning for last year's World Congress on Books, which was sponsored by UNESCO and held in London. We, in addition to projects, symposia, lectures, which are all open to the public, we put out a number of publications, and let me show some of these to you and then tell you about some of our projects, and then maybe we can have some discussion. I've mentioned our board. Our board, as I said, has representatives from organizations, but it also has interesting individuals who we think can contribute to the center. And sometimes I mean that literally, because one of the reasons we have such a large board is also to try to entice book collectors and others who might be interested in giving contributions to the center. And just to round off the money-raising part of it, let me say something. We have a category, we call them companions of the book. If somebody gives us $1,000 a year or pledges us $1,000 a year, they're called a companion. If they pledge $2,500 a year, they're a patron of the book. And then if they're $5,000 a year or more, they're a benefactor of the book. And we're almost like some of the TV pitchmen, I think, as you see on public television. We have bonuses that we give to people who contribute. And of course, one of the major bonuses would be some of the books that we publish. Now, let me try to take you through a couple of the areas and give you some examples of what we do. Let's take reading promotion for just a minute as a category, and I'll try to talk about it as to what we're doing, what's going on in the United States now, and how we try to involve the publishing community. In that very first article that Dr. Borston wrote before he became Librarian of Congress, he had an idea. And he talked about it, mentioned it in the article, and then shortly after he became Librarian of Congress, he was a speaker at the AAP, the publishers group that I think you've heard from, and he suggested his idea. And his idea was that at the end of certain television programs that, in fact, television should, certain books should be mentioned and people should be led from watching television into the world of books, our basic assumption being that books and the printed word provide entertainment, knowledge in depth in a way that television simply cannot. But we also recognize the fact that television and the video world that we're a part of is much more interesting and attractive in some ways to all of us, much more eye-catching than the world of books. So the notion would be, rather than saying, turn off your television set, don't watch television, television is terrible, to say, to generalize, television is with us. Let's find out how we can use television to promote books and get people to read, get people to use libraries, get people to buy books and think about books. And that is the origin, really, of our Read More About It project with CBS Television that you probably have read about if you get to see the bulletin. You see those long lists. That all came about from our first symposium, which was called Television, the Book in the Classroom. And it's from then on, I mean, this is kind of the general pattern we have followed. We invited people who were educators, we invited television people to come together, and publishers as well, and to talk about ways that television might be used to promote books and reading. We had an idea, and it was Dr. Borston's idea, and that was that one of these networks, and we had all three networks here, might involve themselves with the Library of Congress in a project to suggest books that viewers could read and go to their libraries and bookstores to read more about it. And that's precisely what happened, and our CBS project now is in its going into its fourth year, and I suppose some of you have seen the messages. CBS pays for it. The Library of Congress, through its General Reference Office, comes up with lists of books that relate to upcoming CBS programs. The Center for the Book is the office that works with CBS on this. We get a list of programs ahead of time that are coming up. We talk to people, decide which ones we want the Library of Congress to be associated with, go to the general reading room folks. They come up with the lists. The lists are published in lots of book and trade journals, but then the star of the program comes on at the end of the program and says that if you enjoyed this program, the Library of Congress recommends these books. 2 to 3 books are mentioned, but the gist of the message really is, if you want to learn more about the subject, go to your local library or bookstore. They will be happy to help you read more about it. CBS has gotten many, many well-known stars to give the messages, and these folks have become friends of the Library of Congress, by the way, in the process, because we thank them. Sometimes Dr. Borston has them here. They see the Library of Congress for the first time, and some of the people who've recently given them include Cicely Tyson, Gene Stapleton, Christopher Reeve, Superman, Mickey Rooney, James Mason, Art Buchwald, etc., Charlie Brown himself. And we have in my office a nice big drawing that was done by Charles Schultz that he did especially for us when Charlie Brown did a Read More About It message. So that is an example of a very successful reading promotion project using television to get people to think about books. Somebody asked me yesterday, they said, well, I assume that you routinely notify all the publishers whose books are mentioned on your television spots that their book is going to be mentioned. And I had to chuckle a little bit because I do remember I had that idea 4 years ago when this started, and we did send out kind of a little form letter, and it brought us nothing but trouble because publishers wrote back and said, oh, either you picked the wrong book, I mean, why didn't you pick this book, which we have on our list, or your bibliographer got the price wrong, or you should know about this book that's coming out. And it just got terribly involved, and I remember just saying, I can't handle it. We dropped it. And I guess now that we're kind of more in a routine now, that perhaps we should be doing that. One of the questions I often get is, where do your complaints come from? We have had complaints from publishers from that year about the books we picked, and we ask for those because I sent these letters out. We have had complaints from authors, but most of our complaints have come from pressure groups or groups that take a topic. For example, Mickey Rooney's message, I don't know that you saw a bill, but it was a subject about mental retardation. And there were 2 mental retardation groups that did not like the books that we picked at all. And we heard from them, and they didn't let it go. And we heard from them again. And I wrote back and said that, they said, why don't we insist you change those books. Well, these messages are taped once. And, we're lucky to get them on tape. And then to make all of this worse, CBS has now started repeating this program with our message. And, of course, we want the message repeated, but it's the one that brought the biggest fuss. And, it's just a matter of opinion, really. And that's why we don't mention the name. You read some of the language we use. It's done deliberately. We say that the general reading room picks the books. And after all, picking books is part of a librarian's job. We do bibliographies all the time. When this first started, Dr. Borston was asked, isn't this a rather risky business to use the name the Library of Congress in association with these particular books? But he pointed out that, in fact, isn't that what a bibliography really is somebody picking books, and we just are doing this in a more visible manner than we've done it before. So at any rate, that's enough on that project, and we could talk about it if you'd like. But we're hard at work on it. It's going into its 5th season. This last year, CBS practically wore us out. We did over 25 programs. But we're trying to, with CBS, get a little more imaginative. And I'm not a television person, even though I'm becoming a television person. And I think their messages are pretty staid. And I can think of much livelier ways to do their messages now. And the idea of rolling the books isn't good. And a lot of librarians, people who really know about this have said they think this is pretty dull stuff. But, of course, the gist of the message is the name of the Library of Congress, the notion of going to your library or your bookstore, and the association with CBS. And CBS is very happy with it, and as long as they're paying a lot for this, because this is money they could be selling. It's not public service time. So we have to sort of go with them and try to influence them as best we can. And this next year we're going to try to suggest some more imaginative spots. And in fact, we had a couple of this year. We had one with the Rose Bowl Parade. I tell CBS what I want is the Super Bowl, though. And I see no reason we shouldn't recommend books on sports, which we've not done yet, for sports programs. Our problem there is that's a different department in CBS. I mean, they are a bigger bureaucracy than we are. So anyway, this next year, as long as we're into this with both feet, I want the sports department and I want the Super Bowl. So we'll see if that happens. Second reading promotion project, which is a good one, is called Books Make a Difference. And if you get any mail from the Library of Congress, now you see Books Make a Difference is on, I'm told this is a postal slug. You know, there's a little slogan that's across the mail that the Library of Congress is sending out now, and it says Books Make a Difference. Well, this is believe it or not, started as a project, and it was an oral history project that the Center for the Book commissioned. These ideas come from our board members, really, is how this one came. And we sent somebody with an interviewer around the country, and he and his wife interviewed people at all walks of life about books that they had read that they liked, and asked them what was the book and how did that book make a difference in your life. Again, this is one of these awareness projects. So it was fun, and in fact a book is coming out based on their interviews. But the whole notion of it for the Center for the Book was to kind of develop a model project that other people could use. And so what we did were some posters and some information aimed at libraries and local communities, saying, here's a great idea for reading promotion. It's to interview people, and here's some ways you might go about it, and here's some of the benefits it might have for you, and here's what we did. And you're free to crib or to use the questions or the techniques that we developed. And it was a fun project in that we interviewed people on the street, and then some Hollywood stars once again. And we had a wonderful, I don't think I have the exact quote with me, but it was Walter Matthau was here, and he was staying down in the Watergate Hotel. And we heard he was in town, and so with our usual shotgun approach, tried to get in to see him, to get our interviewer down there. Well, they wouldn't see our interviewer, but did say that if I wrote a nice polite letter on Library of Congress stationery, that perhaps Mr. Matthau might answer the questions in writing. And he did. And I got back a letter a couple of weeks ago, and it said, "Dear Center for the Book, thank you for your letter. The book that made the greatest difference in my life was The Secret in the Daisy by Carol Grace." I looked at that, and I'd never heard of this book in my life. I mean, most people will say, the Bible, or a children's book, or something lots of us have heard about. And I'd never heard of this. But then he went on to say something to the effect that this book had such a tremendous impact on me. He said it took me from being a miserable wretch, unhappy with my life, to becoming a joyful, glad to be alive human being. I said, what is this? He said, I loved the book so much, I searched out the author, Carol Grace, and I married her. And it's a true story. And I said, boy, now there's a book that made a difference in somebody's life. So not all of our stories are that dramatic, but nonetheless, you can see that it's that kind of story we love to have, because that makes people think, and you probably thinking right now, if one interviewer came up and stuck a mic under your nose and said, what book has made the greatest difference in your life, what would you say? In fact, a lot of people, it wasn't a book. It was a newspaper ad sometimes that they read. But what our focus, again, was as much on reading as on specific books. But it was on developing a project and using this slogan. And again, it's making people think about books and the fact that they can affect their lives. Fun thing is about to happen. One nice thing about this job is you spin these ideas out. You never know how they're going to come back. Well, Books Make a Difference is out there floating around now with all of these groups. And the American Book TABA, the American Book Awards, 2 years ago used this as their theme, Books Make a Difference. Except one of the narrators took issue with the slogan. He said, that's a stupid slogan. He said, that makes about as much sense as saying bricks are hard. I think it was Edwin, forgotten who said that. saying, he said, it's so obvious that books make a difference. I mean, it's such an obvious statement. Well, that's to a literate people. I mean, to people who read, it's very obvious. But again, this is one of the Center for the Book projects that isn't necessarily aimed at people who read, even though we have plenty of projects that do. Well, at any rate, a nice thing has happened, and that is the Xerox Educational Corporation, which is one of our donors, has taken the idea and did a contest, and I put something in the bulletin about this, for students all over the country. They published little, things like Weekly Reader and a few of these newsletters that are magazines, student magazines that blanket the country. Well, they ran in their Read magazine a contest for students, and it was an essay contest. Write about a book that made a difference in your life and why, in 200 words or less. But they were very smart in that they said they would take one entry per class, and it had to be sent in by the teacher. So in a lot of classrooms around the country, between November 15th and December 31st, kids wrote these essays, and many hundred apparently came into Xerox from teachers. The class had picked the winning essay, which by itself it's a nice process, because obviously it was a subject of class discussion. And I got a call. We now have a winner, and I don't know the book. It's a student in Rhode Island, and he, of course, one of the prizes is the grand prize is a trip to Washington, D.C. For the student, and parents with somebody from Xerox will be accompanying them, and of course they will be coming to the Library of Congress, and of course they will meet the librarian, and we will probably learn a lot about whatever the book is that this young student, whichever book it is that made a difference in this student's life. So those are examples of good reading promotion projects that go for a popular audience, basically. Now, on the more scholarly side, we have a group of people associated with us who are interested in the history of books. And our feeling, my feeling, and this is almost my own insistence now, though, is that these audiences go together, and that books appeal to people of all persuasions, and that the Center for the Book should be a place where we can bring together people who are interested in all kinds of different aspects of books, whether it be reading promotion for a popular audience or the study of the history of books for a more scholarly audience. And I will just show you a couple of the more scholarly publications that we've put out, and which are fun for us. And these, again, are done largely with people who are on our advisory board, but it's using money that the Center for the Book has obtained from private sources. Now, for those of us who work for the government, that means basically that we don't go through the government printing office for our publications, which also means, at least used to mean more frequently, that they are really quite very attractive publications, and that we have some control over them. This, my interest in the history of the Library of Congress, of course, I love opportunities to work in the LC's history to the book and our various projects. This is a facsimile of the 1812 catalog of the Library of Congress, the catalog of the books that were in the Library of Congress when it was in the Capitol just before it was burned. And it's a nice publication, and we have an essay in it by Bob Rutland, who was the editor of the James Madison papers, who has taken a look at the books that were in that catalog and then tried to write an essay as to Congress and those books and what this might symbolize. And Linda Clausen, whom some of you may know, who's worked on several projects for the Center for the Book, did a marvelous index to these books, and there's an index to author, title, publisher, printer, in many different ways. This came about because of a project that we have with a potential project with Senator Baker. Now, Senator Baker, the majority leader, is a great fan of the Library of Congress, and that doesn't hurt us a bit, of course. And he discovered that his office, the office of the majority leader, is on the site in the Capitol of the original Library of Congress. More or less. Pretty close. And so the notion is that in the public space. This is a nice office. It's right across from where the Supreme Court was recreated. If you've seen the old Supreme Court quarters in the Capitol, there now is a place where you could go in and look at the old quarters. Well, the notion occurred to us that wouldn't it be nice if perhaps the Library of Congress could have a room that in fact would commemorate that location of the first Library of Congress over there, and perhaps we can get some duplicate copies of the first books. And so right now we are hoping that Senator Baker and the Library of Congress, through the Center for the Book, this is one of our projects, can develop a project for this. And now the catch one more time is money. And after a lot of talk, it was decided that in fact Senator Baker would raise the money through a private foundation that he would set up for this particular project. Now, I'm not sure it's going to happen, and of course over the weekend Senator Baker announced he's not going to be around anymore after 2 years, and so I honestly don't know whether this means this project will go full steam ahead or nothing will happen. I just don't know, but in the meantime it stimulated this book, and so I feel good about that. So the book is out, and it sells for $15, in fact. And our other major historical publication, which I'm very proud of, we are very proud of, I'm very proud of our publishing office, is just out, and it's called The Early Illustrated Book, Essays Honoring Lessing J. Rosenwald. It seems to me another one of the functions of our Center for the Book should be to work internally to focus on good, interesting book collections and to help some of our departments and divisions hold symposia. So I try to involve, whenever I can, one of the divisions or departments of the Library of Congress in our symposia, even though I do recall, in thinking of copyright a little bit, at one time when Barbara Ringer was here, we were going to have a major symposia on the act of authorship, which is something I still would like to do with the Copyright Office, but that kind of got bumped when Barbara left, and I still think it's a wonderful idea, and we need to do more with the authors. Well, this was done with the Rare Book Collection, Rare Book Division, and it's a lovely book, and it has, what we did here is to commission essays. You see, with money you can do this. I mean, it's just really surprising. We brought a bunch of scholars together, found out who might be interested in the Rosenwald collection in the Rare Book Division, looked at what's been published on it, realized there was a great scholarly potential in that collection which had never been utilized, and then commissioned essays. The people would go in, look at the collection, write these essays about the collection. So it's a commissioned book in that sense about the scholarly potential of one of the Library of Congress's great book collections. And it was great fun because we brought in cartographers and geographers to look at the collection. And I don't know if any of you know of J.H. Perry, who's a very famous name in this field from Harvard, who came in, and we brought him to the Library of Congress and contributed one of the essays here. And Mr. Perry, unfortunately, just very recently died, and this was his last published essay. So it was nice that he could do it, and his wife tells us he was very, very pleased with the book. He got it just before he died. Now, one other Library of Congress connected, and then I'll get to publishing a little more. I don't know if anybody in this room worked on the editorial project for the National Union Catalog, but the Center for the Book had a symposium when the editing work finished on this gigantic, wonderful project. And once again, we felt it was just important to have a ceremony to mark it and to thank the people who'd worked on it. So we commissioned some essays, and we called it In Celebration, the National Union Catalog Pre-56 Imprints. And we had a talk by Mr. Welsh, the deputy librarian. But then, in the kind of the Center for the Book way of trying to bring various elements together to focus on the subject, we had a librarian talking, then we had David Smith, who was the editor, talked about editing, the editing process for the NUC. We had the publisher, John Commander from Mansell, came and talked about the publishing. And then we had an antiquarian bookseller, Bernard Rosenthal from San Francisco, who talked about the uses that a bookseller might make of the NUC. And then a couple of scholars talked about scholarly uses. Okay, so much for the history of books. the future of books. Probably the major project, a couple of major projects really, but one that you may have seen or know of is probably most germane to this particular course is a series of symposia we had on publishing. And I don't know whether, have you seen this?
I've seen it.
Yeah, the book, where we held several meetings on the well, idealistically we call these the private and public responsibilities of the American publisher. And we brought publishers together for a series of 2 meetings where we commissioned papers, again, for publishers to talk about their responsibilities beyond making money, all right? And of course, some publishers said they didn't have any responsibility beyond making money. Well, we didn't invite them. No, they were there. But they certainly didn't give papers. But this was an attempt on our part to, again, involve publishers with the broader book world. And we brought in booksellers, and then we brought in librarians, and then if we really carried the cycle out, we would have commissioned some authors as well. But it got rather complicated, and finally we called it to a halt after 3 of these, and we've published the papers. And I'll just give you a notion of what's in it. Mr. Glickus from one of the publishing firms did a paper on having responsibilities and being responsible. Louis Kozer, I don't know whether you know of him, who is a student of the publishing world and had just published a big book called Books, Publishing and Culture, the Commerce of Culture, the Culture of Commerce. At any rate, he gave kind of a preliminary assessment about the publishing industry. Mr. Carl Krock, K-R-O-C-K, from the Krock bookstores in Chicago, talked about American publishers and booksellers. And then we commissioned a paper on the economics of publishing, and I cannot believe the graphs and charts that came out, but they did, by Mr. Wayne Nordberg. Has he been participating in your symposium at all? Then finally, really the major issue here, and one that you've probably talked about in your course here, these occurred just when all the threats were coming out, or all the talk about concentration in the publishing industry and the threat of the conglomerate and what it was doing to the book and to reading, and the fact that there was a lot of fear of small publishers being swallowed up by the conglomerates. But even more than that, the fear was that as the publishing industry lost the distinct traits, as the gentleman publisher went the way of passed out of existence, that in fact fewer books of substance, of important, serious books, would be published. And so I don't know whether you saw that series of articles in the New Yorker by Thomas Whiteside, where he talked a lot about the fear of conglomerates and what was happening. Well, the U.S. Senate held some hearings on the subject, and I wasn't there, but and they were statements, and it was called Concentration in Book Publishing and Bookselling, held in 1980. And we don't hear as much about that subject anymore, even though it's still a relevant one. But being on Capitol Hill and putting this book together, I called up the Senate committee and I said, gee, I would love to get some of those statements from your hearings, because people like, Archibald MacLeish sent in a statement, and E.L. Doctorow, and I'd read some of these, and I said, when will your hearings be published? And they said, oh, we're not going to publish those. And, attention had gone on to something else. And I said, hey, can we publish those statements? And I said, they'd be great in this book. So I tripped over there one day, and lo and behold, they gave me the statements, and all I had to do was write a letter to the head of the committee and say, I would like to publish these statements about books and publishing and the fear of the great conglomerate publisher in our little book. And we got permission from the chairman, and it happened. So anyway, it's a good source book on various topics relating to publishing. One more example. It's hard to stop giving you examples. Another example of an important subject in the book world. The Textbook in American Society is the name of this symposium. And this was fun because we had some educators and on our committee that thought this would be a good idea. We also had a representative from the National Institute of Education. And this was 2 years ago when they had money. And they said, gee, if we co-sponsor something together, we can put up the money. And I said, you're the kind of co-sponsor I like. So we will organize it and you will pay for it, all right? All right. So we brought together textbook authors with textbook publishers, really. I mean, those were the two essential ingredients. And then threw in a few other people who were concerned with subjects like adopting textbooks in the States, the people who in Texas and others who were so concerned with adoption, and some teachers, and had really the first major symposium on the role of the textbook in society that had been held for quite a while. And one of the participants who didn't come but was able to send a statement was Francis Fitzgerald, who had just published that book. Did you see it on American history textbooks, which was really a good book, and it was right on the subject, and I was hoping she could come to the symposium, but she couldn't. But she did send a statement about her feelings on the subject, and we were able to include it in the proceedings. Now, why was this significant? Who cares in a way? What was interesting was that for the first time, at least some of these more famous authors of textbooks in the education field, people like Gene Shaw and others, got together with textbook publishers, and they learned a lot. And it was very interesting because the whole notion of how a book gets published, which I know is one of your subjects here, is by itself an interesting subject, but it also, for someone like an author, learning how some of those decisions were made in textbook publishing meant an awful lot to them, not just for financial reasons, even though I think that was part of it. And again, someone said, I didn't know that you, in fact, paid attention to this in the process of publishing a textbook, or it's kind of a mutual educational experience, which is one of the reasons that we try to publish something. Again, here we're talking about publishing, but it seems to me that if you have that kind of an experience or an exchange of information going on, that it's important to make certain that survives, and how better to make certain it survives than to publish it in some kind of a booklet. And so we do have all of these dialogues and discussions which are here, which are edited, severely edited, to try to get the essence of them and put out in a little book called The Textbook in American Society. Now, I will conclude simply by saying that in addition to these more, which I consider to be more substantive publications, that statement's going to get me in trouble because our viewpoints, we have a viewpoint series of publications which are very handsome, and I guess they are substantive, but they aren't quite as substantive as some of our major sale publications. And here are some of the viewpoints that we have published. Now, we give these away, which is kind of silly because they cost us a lot to publish, but in part they are public relations documents because they explain in the front what the Center for the Book is and the fact we need money, and that if anybody wants to contribute, we'll be happy to take their money. But let me show you some of these. 3 of them, we have 8 of them out so far. 3 of them are talks by Dr. Borstun, which makes sense since these are all talks about what I consider to be Center for the Book subjects, which concern him very much. One is called Gresham's Law, Knowledge or Information, and this is his speech which he made at the White House Conference on Library and Information Services. And it's a good speech, and it's very thoughtful, and the distinction he makes is one which we now make, I think, almost naturally as we contemplate what's happening to the book in the age of the computer, and that is there is a difference between information and knowledge. He connects knowledge here with knowledge institutions, with libraries, with books. He connects information more on the side of the computer, and we'll talk about, and this of course leads to the discussion about the book of the future, and does the book have a future, but if you make that distinction between knowledge and information, it's rather simple to see that in fact, some kinds of books probably don't have a future. Those are probably the books that are concerned mostly with producing information that goes out of date quickly, directories, these kinds of informational books. And this distinction is made rather very nicely by Dr. Borston in this talk. Give you a couple of other examples. The State of the Book World, 1980, these were talks given at our annual meeting of our huge National Advisory Board, at which time we try to have some kind of an event that will make a contribution to our enterprise. And we had 3 nice talks about the state of the book world, one from an author, Alfred Kazin, the critic, one from Mr. Lacey, Publishing Enters the 80s, which has a wonderful lead. Let's see. Which I probably can't find right now. It's not the lead, obviously. But he's talking about book publishing, and it's a nice statement, in fact, about book publishing. And if you'd like sets of this for the course, I can provide them to you, I think. But somewhere in here he talks about publishing as being an unmitigated mess. And then he explains why it's a mess in the United States at this particular time and what might or might not be done about it. And I, of course, cannot find the quote, but I'll leave it for you. On the scholarly side, on the history of libraries and scholarship, a talk. The audience for children's books. We have worked very closely with the Children's Literature Center in the Library of Congress and helped them because we have money to pay speakers and they don't. I mean, that's what it amounts to. So we have had some symposia and sponsored with them the annual Children's Book Week lecture. And then here's a viewpoint that reflects our international interests. It's called The International Flow of Information, a Trans-Pacific Perspective. This was another one of these marvelous symposia that got funded by somebody else. And our co-sponsor with the money this time was the U.S. International Communication Agency, now known as USIA, back to its old name. And the notion was to examine the flow of information, not just books, the flow of information between the Trans-Pacific area and the United States. And they selected 16 participants from Pacific countries who were either librarians, publishers, the head of some of the major publishers from that part of the world, and a couple of broadcasters, but a lot of government officials were selected for a visitors program paid for by USIA. We had a symposium in Hawaii on the subject, and then they came on to the rest of the United States, as I learned to say, for a tour of book publishing in New York, government publishing in Washington, D.C. Then we ended up at ALA was in Dallas that year, and I put them all on the stage and asked them to tell us what they learned about the flow of information between their part of the world and the United States, and some of their statements are summarized in this little publication. This was, again, a little bit on the public relations side in working with publishers. They spent 2 full days at the Library of Congress. Some of you may have met them. We had 3 national librarians who were on this particular program. But it was a lot of fun, and the one memory I have, though, has very little to do with, the major memory, with the publishing side of things, except that we decided it would be, after all of this high-powered talk, when the AAP was a major sponsor of this, and they put money into it, and everybody was falling all over these folks, and we had a reception for them. They flew in from California, if you can imagine, after visiting the Los Angeles Times, television studio and something, seeing television news in Los Angeles. They flew in, this was in June, it was just as hot as it could be, to New York, and that very, the minute they got off the plane, they were picked up in a bus and brought out by the AAP to the Tavern on the Green in Central Park, where we had a big reception, and did the whole bit. Well, after all of this treatment, we decided it would be a lot of fun to look at publishing in a small town. And so we got out the map, and it looked like the group was going to be in Dallas for ALA, and it turned out that the ICA had a visitors program, and they had somebody who was really a sharp person in Corsicana, Texas, which was about 60 miles, 70 miles from Dallas. I don't know if anyone is here from Corsicana. So we maneuvered everything, and they got a bunch of volunteers together and came in to Dallas at the ALA Hotel and picked up our group, and about 10 cars, and we headed off to Corsicana and had a wonderful day in that we started by, we visited the local library, we visited the local radio station, we visited, the minute we arrived at the visitor center, somebody came and interviewed some of the visitors from Asia and took pictures. Well, by the time the day was over, we had copies of the newspaper article with their pictures and everything. And then we went to the local Rotary Club for lunch, which was held in, I think it was Kiwanis, I think, and it was in the basement of a church. It was a home-cooked meal. And this turned out to be really one of the best ways for them to learn about the United States, one of the best days they had. Everyone had to sing. And I don't know if you know how these clubs go, but they got fined for this and that. And then at the end, they presented us all with Corsicana, Texas T-shirts. So it was the whole bit. But at any rate, it turned out to be one of the best days on publishing, and was really called communications in a small town. And that's the sort of thing that you can do if you, I think, take advantage of some of the opportunities and are lucky enough to have a vehicle like the Center for the Book to kind of be a driving wedge into some of these other government agencies and try to develop programs that we hope in the long run mean something. Finally, on the international scene, we have a group of publishers who are quite concerned with international matters. Leo Albert, some of the others who in fact were speakers for us here. Data Smith, I don't know whether you know any of these names. Mike Keplinger, in fact, was a speaker at this Hawaii conference. But they encouraged us to put together kind of an inventory of U.S. international book programs. This is an old idea. I don't know whether you've talked much about the international side of things, but in truth, in the 60s, as you know, across the board in the library field and in the publishing field, the 60s were much more prosperous than the 70s and the 80s. And so what we did was to do an inventory of what's going on in book programs both in the U.S. government and outside, that promote books and reading, and also that promote publishing overseas. And a survey like this was done in the 60s, and the book was this thick. This was about all that we could come up with in the 1980s. But there's a nice essay in the beginning by Jack Putnam who talks about the book crisis in the developing world and some of the really the forces that are really cutting into, I think, in some ways, the whole publishing scene internationally, and certainly the flow of information, which is one of the concerns of the Center for the Book. Well, I've talked enough, too much, and let me close and ask you if you've got any questions I can answer on the Center for the Book or any of the subjects I brought up. Somebody's got to have a question. Yes?
John, how much is the Center for the Book involved in new technologies with publishers and discussions on that?
Well, Jane, as much as we're involved in anything, in other words, we can't get very deeply involved into any of these subjects. We have had a couple of symposia where, in fact, we sponsored a talk, I think you might have heard that one, by Louis Branscombe, who was looking at video disc technology. And two of the talks that were sponsored by the Center for the Book have been published in a book which I don't have with me, but it was published by Elliot Minsker and Knowledge Industry Publications, and it's called Libraries, Communications, and the Future. And the nice part of that book is that he acknowledges the Center for the Book, and with a little preface, and says that any royalties that they earn on this book, on the future of the book, will come to our Center for the Book. So that's a nice gesture. We have no projects, however. For example, we don't have a video disc project like we have a television project, but we're certainly open to it. And I would be quite pleased if we develop something with some of these in the field of electronic publishing. But it would have to be a subject that linked our various groups together. I mean, that's the key to it. And you know, we wouldn't want to get too deeply into video text as a subject, except if we might have a conference where we tied, you know, the implications of video text to the library community or reading promotion or some other subject. I guess our requirement really is a broad enough base that we can involve these various groups that are part of our enterprise, which is not to exclude this subject. It's just that it's like most other subjects. We need an angle, and if we can find a good angle, we'll pursue it. Yes?
When you commission an essay for any of your projects, do you have to pay the authors for their writing for that effort?
Oh, indeed we do. Indeed we do. And that's what I mean by commissioning, really. So that's how we are able to involve people. I mean, now some people, Barbara Tuckman has been closely involved with us, and Barbara's not only never accepted any money from us, she's given us money, and also given us the rights at the same time to a wonderful essay that she did called The Book, which we published, and which was published overseas, copyrighted by Barbara, and she in fact gave us the rights. So
it seems as though for a national effort, which is what this program is about, that some of the authors would be interested in donating.
I would think so too. It's not as if we don't try to get them to donate, and in some cases, I must say, we're not paying much, and we're paying what are really token honoraria. We don't, I mean, we pay people, you know, $250 or $500 for something, and, you know, in this day and age, that's peanuts, and they really accept that as kind of as a token, I think. And, but you're right, I mean, if somebody doesn't want to accept payment, we don't quibble at all. And that's a problem, though, because where are we really weak? We are weak on the author side, and while Barbara Tuckman and we've had some wonderful people who are closely involved with us, we don't have enough authors. We've not yet had a symposia on authorship and its importance. I would like to have more authors involved in our enterprise, but they're hard to involve. And you certainly have to pay a lot sometimes because they don't make much money. So I'd say that's one of our weaknesses. Another weakness we have, as long as we're into this enterprise, is we don't really have enough corporate involvement. We have to move outside the publisher.